Welcome to More Lore,
where we talk more lore. And today we are finishing up our talk about Elżbieta Zawacka. I may be saying that name right this time. I don't know. Let's try. So she, to remind everybody, is a Polish resistance fighter, spy, I will say paratrooper, since she parachuted. I'm not quite sure if that's the proper use of it. I think paratrooper may be a specific term, but she parachuted into Poland, over into occupied Poland, which was occupied by the Nazis during World War II. So we've talked about this in episode, I probably should have looked at the other episode. We just did season 12, episode 5. So you can go hear part 2 of her story there. Part 1 of her story is in season 11, and I'll duct tape all these together and put them together on YouTube so we can have one whole thing of them. But so I just wanted to talk a little bit more about her life. We're going to talk just a little bit before she jumped out of the plane, and then just talk about what happened after she jumped out of the plane, because her life continued to go on. She cosplays as a nun. She gets arrested a bunch of times. So just some fun facts about her life that I wanted to share. So what we said in part 2 was that she was doing a lot of campaigning to get women get recognized in part of military service, right? Because women during, especially the Polish army at that time and in Britain's army, were auxiliary services, right? They weren't necessarily entrenched into the actual military, which just meant that they were entitled to some of the same privileges. You said there are some kind of bonuses sometimes from being outside of that wheelhouse, but she wanted to make sure that women got the recognition so that they deserved. So in order to do that, she wanted to learn all she could, though, about the Polish and British women's auxiliary service, because that's what everybody was saying they should emulate. So she's like, okay, if I'm going to talk about this, I need to know. So the newish Polish women's auxiliary service, known as the Peszki, Pestki, from its Polish acronym of PSK, which translates as pips or seedlings, have been formed from a group of Polish forces who had been deported to Siberia. Female volunteers so they had gone to, like, when the military went to France to fight and other places, and the women went with them as auxiliary services, they got deported with them, and they got deported to Siberia. So the female volunteers of appropriate age, even if they weren't, but that's generally where they came from. So the female volunteers of appropriate age received training to become medics, welfare and education officers, cooks, clerks, coders, wireless operators, and military drivers. There had been Polish PIPs in Britain, led by women who had not been members of the PWK that Elżbieta belonged to, or had any military training, which was something that Elżbieta scorned. As men do, they made an officer's wife who knew nothing a commander. Ooh, burn. Yeah, she had less contempt for the British women's auxiliaries, it seems. And there was many organizations in Britain during WW2 with hundreds of thousands of women volunteering. I do believe that Britain also had a conscription where you had to choose between what you were going to do, and you could volunteer to, like, help out in factories or to go, volunteer with one of these organizations. So 6,000 of those volunteered with the First Aid Nursing Yeomanry, or FANY. Likened to combat medics, they earned their names for riding horses to rescue wounded soldiers. And although they wore uniforms, they were not part of the British Armed Forces. So they changed their name in 1937 to become the Women's Transport Service, now they have the acronym WTS FANY, because they wanted to sever that nursing connection, right? Basically, they're like, combat medics is really their main job, just transporting wounded things, and they would do first aid, but
triaging and moving, not necessarily providing full nursing services.
Right. So, and also just being like, hey, we're not nurses. Those are different. That's a different type of thing. They probably were like, stop calling us fucking nurses. So during the Second World War, FANY supported the SOE, which was the Special Operation Executives we were talking about last time, as coders, signalers, forgers, dispatchers, and most famously as agents. Since they were independent from the British military, FANY women could bear arms, and they were trained because women, if they were associated with the British Army, you couldn't have combat, right? And you couldn't carry arms. But since they're not in the military, they get to have guns. So they were trained in firearms and explosives, and they got set in where men couldn't go. FANY was designated to provide support for the Polish troops that were stationed in Britain. Elżbieta sought a meeting with their commander and was directed to Staff Commander Marion Granwell, a World War I vet whose friends called a queer fish and who the younger FANYs called a battle axe. Granwell offered Elżbieta tours of all the women's bases across England and Scotland. So she visited the Royal Air Force's Bentley Priory, a former royal residence, and the nearby Women's Auxiliary Air Force's Training Center. At Royal Air Force Kenley, she met WAF plotters on radar duty. So in the middle of the room, there was a table shaped like the British Isles, divided into sections and manned by headphone WAFs, I think I'm saying that right, who moved tiny model aircraft around the table based on the reports coming in over their headphones. And I'm assuming they made tiny airplane noises as they did that, because I would just be like, okay, we're coming in, we're moving over the British Isles. But that just seems like a really cool job. So she also visited Kinnaird House in the central lowlands of Scotland. The Polish military had taken over this manor. There she saw courses in weather forecasting and driving armored vehicles, which led her to take a ride in a tank. I really only put this in so I could talk about why I think we all think it would be fun to ride in a tank.
Correct.
Yes. I don't think there's a single person who's like, would turn that down. I think everyone, it just seems like it would be fun.
Yeah, I agree. I have not ridden in a tank. I've ridden in some cool things, not a tank.
Not a tank. So I'm just saying, I mean, I don't want to be in I don't want to be in the circumstance where I could ride in a tank.
Need to be in a tank.
Yeah, right. Need to be in one, but I would like to voluntarily ride in a tank. That would be fun. So, all right. So that is
live out our tank girl dreams.
Live out my tank girl dream. Correct. That's why my hair is shaved the way it is. So that's a little bit about her time before she jumped out of a plane. Now we're going to after she jumped out of the plane. And so we're going to right before the Warsaw Uprising. So Elżbieta took refuge in a convent. Dressing in the postulant's uniform of dark blue, this was a very quote, a postulant's uniform of dark blue cotton with a close-fitting white cap, a dull version of the sisters' more picturesque sapphire and white robes. So apparently that if you're a postulant, you got really boring dark cotton, and if you were a nun, you got these awesome sapphire robes, which I guess I would also be jealous of.
Yeah.
So, but she totally cosplayed being a nun. She started her days at 5 with prayers in the chapel, followed by silent meditation, psalms, and sometimes Gregorian chanting. Ever the school teacher, she taught the girls, but also helped with the farm's physical labor. Other than that, she got left alone, which she just thought was fine because there was a lot for her to process. Yeah. She stayed at the convent until she just couldn't take it anymore and returned to the city, where she briefed new recruits of the Home Army's women's military service. So now they had so many volunteers, there weren't enough munitions to go around. So only those with a prior experience really got to serve in armed forces, and the other women were put to work preparing and circulating news sheets, delivering messages, transporting weapons, food, and medicines, and serving as medics. That makes sense, right? Yeah. So after the Warsaw Uprising, Elżbieta was not going to surrender. So we talked about this in part 2, that when the Home Army surrendered to the Nazis before the Soviet invasion, a lot of them surrendered and became prisoners of war.
Right.
Elżbieta was not going to do that. She was like, I'm getting the fuck out of Warsaw and I'm going back to the convent. So she goes back to the convent. She's got a companion named Vaka with her, Wacka. I'm assuming that's Vaka. And so the nuns were very happy to see them. They fed them, they clothed them, they put them on a train that terminated in the Polish holy city of Częstochowa. I am putting this in here because that is a one Polish word I know that I'm saying correctly. So they go to the holy city of Częstochowa, where they witness the daily unveiling of the Black Madonna at the monastery, which Elżbieta found profoundly emotional, as the icon is known as the Queen and Protector of Poland and symbolizes both both Polish patriotism and female defiance. So from that kind of holy pit stop, she goes on, she's not very a sentimental person from most of the things we've talked about. She didn't want stockings. She doesn't, but to like take this time to, to witness something that was so important to Poland and has encountered in her stories before.
Yeah, that's cool.
Yep.
So meaningful.
Meaningful. Right.
Yeah.
So she goes on from there to Krakow to try and rebuild Farmstead after all of the arrests and everybody's in prison. During a side quest to test a route between Switzerland and France, she dressed in deep widow's mourning attire with a dramatic black veil covering her face in the German style. She now carried only the most basic identity papers and a travel permit to visit her wounded brother at the large military hospital near the Swiss border. And she has another one of her shenanigan encounters where she's on a train and the woman next to her has real papers from the hospitals that hers were faked from. So it's like the woman has a real stamp on the papers and hers was a forged stamp that they just made up. So she faints. Okay, she pretends to faint so that they forget about her for a couple of minutes. And then they're like, oh yeah, we forget what that stamp looked like. Whatever, fine, old lady in mourning veils. Ooh, I'm so sorry. Me bruter, So, and they just ignore her. And so that's how she was able to carry on her spying. Yep. So in January of 1945, Stalin sent forces to Warsaw to quote unquote liberate Poland from the Germans who were already gone, and the city was over 80% destroyed. The home army disbanded. Emilia, her boss, gave Elżbieta one last identity card in her real name and $20 American for demobilization pay. Germany surrenders in May, but this is not the end of Elżbieta's story as a resistance fighter, because the Soviets come through and they start arresting and torturing everyone. Eventually, 103...
Sounds very Soviet-y.
Yes. And so as Poland is moving under their communist rule, all of the silent unseen, because they were associated with Britain, now they're saying they're all traitors because of that British connection. So eventually 103 of the silent unseen, whom the SOE had helped trade, were arrested and sentenced to either imprisonment or execution. The Soviets would arrest 300,000 Poles between 1944 and 1956, executing 6,000, and more were just disappeared. Elżbieta was arrested in 1951 after $10 of her demobilization money was found in a spool of thread. And she was also accused of meeting to collect and transfer spy material with somebody else who had been arrested. So she was tortured, but she did not snitch. She was sentenced to 10 years. She went to Fordham prison, which had previously been used by the Nazis. There, she began to teach the inmates, a crime punished by loss of privileges when discovered. Later, she was transferred to a less harsh prison before being transferred to another one where she was brought to teach mathematics to the detained population of girls who were aged 18 to 21. And soon she was also teaching the guards, then running a correspondence course linked to the local high school, enabling both the prisoners and the guards to obtain high school diplomas. Things did somewhat lighten up in the prisons after Stalin pissed himself and died in 1953. Elżbieta had her sentence reduced and was released in February of 1955. In 1956, an amnesty released 35,000 former Home Army soldiers from the prisons. But Elżbieta still had trouble getting work as a teacher because of her arrest record. So she goes up to the Minister of Education in Warsaw and wouldn't leave until she walked out with a permit saying that she was allowed to teach on official letterhead. Then she continued to work on her own schooling and got her doctorate in 1965. She became a valued expert in correspondence education and eventually an associate professor at Gdańsk University. She labored tirelessly to build a correct army of the Home Army and the Silent Unseen's history. In 1976, she was arrested for carrying material from the London Archive, which disputed the official communist story of the uprising and the war, and she was again detained a few months later. In 1978, the Polish Security Service closed the Department of Adult Education at the university in Turin where she was teaching. She used the forced retirement to further her project of documenting the historical record, and they tried to arrest her again in 1981 for political dissent, but she gave them the slip by checking herself into a clinic that they did not think to look in for her. And she's very much an elderly lady at this time, but she's still just like, fuck off. I'm going like, no, I'm not going back to prison. So in 1990, Zoe's archive, Elżbieta's archive, was given a building and legal status as a foundation to promote research into Polish history, especially the history of the Home Army and the wartime service of Polish women. She worked to tell the stories of service women into her 90s, and she died at the age of 99, 2 months shy of 100. Over 3,000 people came to her funeral. She was carried through the streets of her hometown of Turin on a cannon carriage, and a gun salute was given over her grave. And they had a military band, and they had 3 aircraft that flew over to buzz her funeral. So she got a cool send off, and almost 100 years old, but quite a life and just a very interesting woman. And yeah.
Yeah. Well, and Poland didn't shake communist rule until very late. I mean, comparatively,
it was
to
not.
other countries.
It was not an easy time for her, and I think she was able to go back to London, obviously because she was getting things from
it was in 89 to 90 was their transit, or 91 was their transition away from communism. So it's very recent. And so they were,
yeah, she had the secret police looking at her the entire time, especially because she's trying to create. And I think, that's one of the reasons that beyond the stuff that she was doing during the war, which of course is fascinating, she's crossing mountains and carrying secret documents,
parachuting in.
Yeah. Doing all this cool stuff. But just the fact that she kept doing this throughout her life and knowing that it was so important that this record be true and that history be accurate and not what the victors are claiming it was, and risking so much to do it. And it was also such a hard thing that, because she was such a forceful person, a lot of the archives and histories, apparently she kind of just bullied her way into. She would just go to people and be like, "You're doing this." And they're like, "Okay, we'll do this." "Yes, ma'am."
Sometimes you just got to walk with a purpose, right?
Right. So that is the story of Agent Zoe.
That's awesome. Very cool.
Oh, yeah. As we awkwardly, once again, end more lore.
More lore. Woohoo!